This is my second time recording this audio. I listened to the first version of it and I kind of cringed a little bit. Too many ums, ahs, and I realized that I say, quote unquote, at the end of every sentence. I also listened to it again just to see what I was saying, and I think I rambled too much in a way that, I don't know, it was just embarrassing a little bit. So I wanted to do this video again. Um, I want to do another response video, or rather, use the video that I saw as a jumping off point to add more to the conversation. And if anything, this will help me formalize some thoughts about my practice as an artist and um, what's called, cultural gestures or cultural dialogue or um, something that I think artists need to do more uh, outside of the art world. And it might help me with my upcoming series and my proposal for my MFA programs and all that stuff. So it'll be worth it. This is a response to a pretty interesting conversation between Matt Segal from Footnotes to Plato and Jacob Kashir or Kashir. Sorry if I'm butchering that. From Sense Space. It was a pretty interesting conversation about Christianity outside of the framework of Christianity or Christianity in a pluralistic world. This will be more of like an organic thing. I've taken some bullet points down, but I am just kind of talking and responding to what I found interesting in the video. I wanted to show this time a little bit of my creative process. I'm working on a series that combines hand drawn elements with collage and digital work. I'm trying to redefine what drawing means to me. I was trained classically, and I want to make some experimental artwork that combines pixel art assets that I'm making here, as you see in the video, and layer that on transparent film on top of collage and drawing. So you'll see me working here, and you'll see that I'm tracing over these photos that I have found on databases and Reddit, and I've just scoured the internet for vintage photography, and that inspires my work a lot. I see it as a dialogue that I have with history, like aesthetically. We can talk more about that in future videos. We'll see how that comes in. Jacob and Matt, not to respond to Jacob and Matt, they had a pretty cool conversation about, well, Jacob's experiences is coming into Christianity and then dealing with, secular Western worldview, and also going to what I believe was Mexico and doing ayahuasca and doing plant medicine and seeing the intersection between Christ and a pluralistic indigenous faith. I'm from Central America, and I have a lot to say about that, actually, about the intersection between Christianity and indigenous faiths. Um, there are other things that were talked about, like relations between Islam and the Christian world, and relationships between men and women nowadays, and on Christ outside Christianity and secularism. And generally, I love this conversation. I think it's becoming. I'm seeing what I'm calling like a meta Christianity come up, and it's really cool to see Christianity evolve thanks to the internet and thanks to these conversations in a way that is really positive, in my opinion. I think this talk was very positive, and I really commend Jacob for showing his vulnerability in this video that he, this vulnerability about his feelings. Especially, I mean, I don't agree with some of the stuff that he says, but he says it in good faith. So I do believe that the video was posted in the spirit of good dialogue, and I really commend him for being honest about his anxieties and his thoughts that may be difficult to process, regarding his feelings with Christianity and his feelings about, Islam and the West, and all that. I did want to add to it. It's something that I have experienced not as a Muslim, because I'm not Muslim and I'm not from the Middle East or the Muslim world, um, but it's something as an immigrant I have experienced to some degree that I think makes me want to head to this conversation, about on Islam in the West, or the West and the wider world. I dislike the term the West, because the West, it feels like too much of a hype word for me. Maybe it's because I've seen too many memes of like, save the West, or the West is collapsing, or something like that, to the point where it's kind of trite and a little bit cringe for me to see it over and over. But I do want to also mention that Western civilization, while we share some kind of like metaphysical grammar, as Matt Segal has said and John Vervaeke has said, we share the metaphysical grammar of Neoplatonism. We've never really been unified, despite being Christian. We have had a European history that's filled with wars and disunity and kind of like centuries long rivalries that ended in years and years of bloodshed. You talk about the 100 Years' War between France and Britain, the 30 Years' War between, I believe, what was there's so many, like 30 Years' War, 7 Years' War. I know the 7 Years' War was with Spain and the Netherlands. All these wars between Protestants and Catholics in the late Renaissance, early modern period. Europe has never been unified. It's never been unified. I think even now we're seeing Europe struggling to stand together against threats from Russia and the US. And they are doing their best to stand together, but we see that interests between countries and between classes of people and between all of these different groups come in the way of Western unity, European unity, American unity, Atlantic unity. We are seeing that come apart because I don't think that ever existed. I think the West is, and I'm sure a lot of people have said this before, the West is what we define in contrast to the other, like Edward Said has said, There have also been Muslims in Europe. Spain had Muslim rule for longer than the United States has existed. And it was in that Islamic period of Spain that we saw a lot of the Western undercurrents that we in this corner of the internet are fascinated about, the occult of the West, Kabbalah, the Picatrix, Hermeticism, all of these things were given the space in Muslim Spain and Al-Andalus to ferment and cook and bake and become ready to be imported into Europe. Not that it was meant to just be imported into Europe. The Muslims ran with Platonism. They took it and ran with it when they encountered it. So even to say in my previous comment about Europe having this common metaphysics or metaphysical grammar through Neoplatonism, Islam also has the common metaphysical framework through Neoplatonism. And Matt Segal has mentioned this before, both I believe in this conversation I'm responding to now and a few others as well. John Vervaeke has also, I think, mentioned that. Christians and Jews have also lived in the Islamic world. Spain was a safe haven for Jews while it was Muslim. The Ottoman Empire took in Jews when Spain became Christian, and in 1492 demanded Jews convert, leave, or die. I myself am a descendant of Jews in North Africa that shared the space with Arabs and Christians. Christians also have lived in the Muslim world, the Arab world. Some of the most ancient churches that have been destroyed in the Israeli genocide of Palestine have been in Palestine. They've been in Gaza. So to say that we have the Christian world over here, the Muslim world over there, and we need to speak from a position of strength, I feel ignores a lot of the granularity that you see when you get up close, both in the modern period and in history. We also can't discount colonialism, imperialism, capitalism, military incursions, extractive economies, and neoliberal globalism from the picture. I think Matt was talking about, I believe Matt Segal said here that there is this sense of anger coming from the Islamic world about, Europe and the United States, and there is this vitriol spouted. And you do see, you just, any other day you go into Al Jazeera, you'll see like Arabs burning American flags, I keep saying that. I keep saying, I'm trying to not say it. When you hear me take a longer pause, it's because I'm telling myself, like, don't say, We have hurt the Arab world quite a bit. Iraq was essentially highway robbery, sanctioned through the veneer of international law. Afghanistan, Kuwait, our support for dictators in Syria, Libya, until they weren't useful to us, Damn, I keep saying that. We have used the Middle East as a source of oil, as a source of resource, as a source of contracts for our companies. We've extracted wealth from them. We've paid little to no attention to the lives of everyday Muslims in the Islamic world, as they have suffered. And the genocide that took place in Palestine and is taking place in Palestine is that very precise example. I think that the anger and the vitriol, while unhealthy and while, reprehensible in some cases, comes from this genuine sense that there is no justice. Because the very channels that the West, quote unquote West, uses to settle international disputes when a country or people in the West seek reparations or satisfaction for harms done and damage felt, those are all denied to the Arab world. Those have been denied to Palestine, to Iraq, to Afghanistan. We have also to consider that we would not have such a big problem with Islamic fundamentalism if we hadn't funded it, armed it, and trained it in the 80s and early 90s in our chess game against the Soviets. We armed the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen went on to become the Taliban, and the Taliban went on to create networks of Islamic fundamentalism, and now they rule over Afghanistan with theocracy. We helped that. We created that. So in a certain sense, we're not just dealing with what I think Matt called a reflection in the Arab world. We're also dealing with the karmic consequences on a civilizational scale of the actions that we have taken in decades past. I used to listen to this guy, Dan Atrell, and I think he should be more in the conversation that these channels are having. He's amazing. He's the modern hermeticist. That channel is so cool. I'm kind of a fanboy. In one of his episodes of the Encyclopedia Hermetica series, and I highly recommend you listen to that, the center periphery model comes up, and the center periphery is basically this idea that wealth and power accumulates in a region, and that wealth is accumulated from the periphery. So in this case, Europe and the US have been the center for capital accumulation for the last century, or the last 80 years. And that's at the expense of the global south, Latin America, Africa, the Arab world, Southeast Asia. And in exchange, the center, Europe and the United States, exports its currency, exports its culture, its religion, its language. The lingua franca of the world is English. When I was a child in El Salvador, we transitioned from El Colón to the dollar. And places in Africa also use the euro, even though they're not part of the European Union. I've seen a lot of people complain online about, oh my God, like these African Muslims coming over to France, and you can't even recognize Paris anymore and all that stuff. But it's crazy maybe to think that it's not that nuts to think that French-speaking Africans that have lived in countries that have trade deals that benefit France, because France gets bargain prices on uranium and other minerals from Africa. It's not crazy to think that these people will flock to the center of economic and political power. That's what my family and I did when we moved to the United States. And we did so without papers, by the way. I have a green card now, but I was on DACA for like a long time, on deferred action for childhood arrivals, for a long time. I think we can ask if we have the resources to shelter refugees and immigrants from completely different cultures in our lands. I believe Matt was saying that it's hard to have a Islamic diaspora in a mainly Christian, secular, capitalistic world. And yeah, we can ask if we have the resources to shelter and to naturalize these citizens into or these people into our countries. But we should also ask, I believe, if the wealth we extract from their countries is truly ours, or is it just a loan that our children and grandchildren will pay for, in one form or another. I mentioned just a few minutes ago about Islam being the mirror to Christianity, and Matt mentioned that, and I think that's a really interesting analogy. I like to think that in a truly plural worldview, we wouldn't center Christian culture. Is Islam the cultural mirror or the civilizational mirror to the West, right? Or is the West the mirror image of Islam? It depends where you are. I think one of the earliest example of Western unity, quote unquote, against the other was during the late 15th century, when there was this incursion of the Ottomans into the last vestiges of the Byzantine Empire, and Constantinople falling and becoming Istanbul. This was the first moment where there became a West and the Islamic world. I could be wrong, and I think any historian that wants to correct me, please do. But if the West is defined by what is the other, the West is defined by what it is not, which is the other, then that mirror image is simultaneous. It's simultaneous for both. And I think we should consider that, I think it would be fruitful to add to this conversation to invite more Islamic scholars, actual Muslims that have lived in the Arab world, the Islamic world, I think it would be beneficial to open this um, dialogue with them. I think it's hard to talk about this when we're just Westerners talking. And it would be interesting to see how Neoplatonism comes into the discussion when we start having these openings for that dialogue. Because Neoplatonism is the language, the metaphysical language, the grammar for both worlds. And in that sense, we're not rivals or mirror images. In that sense, we're brethren. Europe and the Middle East, or the Islamic world, are metaphysical cousins, and that's something we can latch onto as we try to see how to coexist in a way that benefits both of us. Those are my takes on the thing about Islam. And I think that what I'm trying to avert in the conversation is an opening for Islamophobia to come in. And I don't pretend to assume that Matt and Jacob here are Islamophobes, In no way are they Islamophobes here. I just think that we have to be very careful when we talk about civilizational conflict, as we're seeing now. We have to be very careful that we don't devolve into us versus them. I think on Christ outside of Christianity, I'm very curious. I'm gonna check out more of Jacob's videos in SenseSpace, because he really said something that played a few strings for me about alluding to the mixture of Christianity and plant medicine and indigenous faiths coming together. Because I was raised in El Salvador until I was 12, and it's a very Catholic country. I was raised Catholic, and even then in El Salvador, indigenous religion and folklore is mixed with that Christianity, and you do have things like brujeria, witchcraft, and curanderos, like witch healers or magical healers. We are taught the Popol Vuh in school, and the Popol Vuh is one of the remaining Mayan codices that sort of showcases the Mayan cosmogony, and the cosmology of the Mayan civilization. And at the same time we were learning that, we were also learning, the sacraments, in Christianity, and the stages of Christ's crucifixion. We have a lot of intermingling in Latin America between the indigenous and the Christian. And Matt gave this amazing remark about how, Spain brings the religion of Christianity as masters to their slaves, which at this point were the colonized people of the indigenous civilizations there, and hoping that the Christianity will make them docile or make them, more apt for servitude. But like Matt was saying, there's this emancipatory and liberatory spirit to Christianity that then empowers the slave to embrace freedom. And we can talk for hours about liberation theology, for sure. And El Salvador was one of those hotspots during the Cold War for liberation theology. It's interesting, this conversation of Christ outside Christianity. El Salvador is also a Neo-Age hotspot, actually. I think I said actually twice. I begun to notice, like, when I'm recording, how many, like, all these quirks about my speech. It's interesting. Well, not interesting, it's annoying to me, but the New Age in El Salvador was prevalent in my childhood. My mom was very much into the New Age stuff, still is. I grew up with UFO magazines, like Latin American UFO magazines, in my home. And these were like all about like energy portals, UFOs, you know, portals to other dimensions, interdimensional traveling, astral travel, psychics, all this stuff that is just all over, um, the internet now. It was in print before. And I was exposed to all of it. I'm looking back fondly. My mom used to be a Hare Krishna, she tells me, in her 20s, I believe, in El Salvador. I remember also one of the uh, times that we hung out with our friends, and this is like one of my earliest memories of seeing my mom hanging out with friends, was that they were charging quartz rocks in salt water in the moonlight. All of this within the context of Christianity, because my mom still had a picture of Jesus in our home, and we still had the cross in the house, and we still had, um, you know, this idea that throughout all of this New Age, indigenous folklore stuff, it all sort of gelled into this Christian context, and we're seeing that now in a very extreme form. And I think Jacob, was saying about doing ayahuasca in Latin America, and I believe it was Mexico. Please correct me if I'm wrong, if you're listening to this. It was this really interesting point of just like the mixture between that, and I do want to say that that's always been there, and that's something that we can latch onto as well as we begin to think about relevance for Christianity in the coming decades, and maybe going into the 22nd century. Pluralism, I think, will be the faith of the future. I think I've gone through my rounds of being a pretty bad Christian to being an atheist in high school after reading Camus and like a little bit of Sartre, as much as I could handle, and going into the existential black hole and looking into New Age and Buddhism. And I went to a Buddhist temple for years. I learned a lot about Theravada Buddhism from a Sri Lankan temple, and eventually tapping into the Western esoteric tradition, quote unquote Western esoteric tradition, because it's also based on Egyptian roots and Mesopotamian roots and all that stuff. Gnosticism, mysticism, Hermeticism, theurgy, and learning about the Platonic roots of these traditions. And at the moment, I am reading through the Iamblichian curriculum of the Platonic dialogues. And now in my early 30s, after years of, spiritual learning through texts and videos and podcasts and putting all that information in my skull, I've become essentially a Neoplatonic, pluralistic polytheist. And I take the Plato and the Neoplatonists very seriously as both philosophy and as spiritual scripture. There's a liturgical element to it for me. And it's been easier to build this kind of pluralistic, polytheistic faith in a theurgical context through paganism than it has been for Christianity, personally. I think Christianity is charged for me with certain memories of being forced to go to Mass, being forced to take First Communion, being forced to do Catholicism school, and there is this sense of, Christianity being a part of my life, not as this redemptive, emancipatory experience, but rather just the humdrum rituals and the familial pressure to take communion and all that stuff. And I was a bad Christian to begin with. Like, I was not. I mean, I was a child, but I was not in this theurgical mindset back then that could really express, the full meaning of Christianity. But theurgical practices through paganism have been very interesting and very fruitful for me. My wife and I have an altar at home, and we've sung the Orphic hymns. We've put offerings to the gods in the altar. We have lit incense. I went through like a phase where I tried to make incense myself, and I was trying all of these things. I got like maca wood powder, and I mixed it with all these different spices, and then I ended up just realizing that it all smells like shit except for straight up just frankincense. So it was fun messing around with that though. I personally think that it's important to take the polytheistic worldview seriously, because Plato was a polytheist, Socrates was a polytheist, Plotinus was a polytheist, Proclus was a polytheist, Porphyry was a polytheist, Iamblichus was a polytheist, Damascus was a polytheist, Hypatia was a polytheist. All of these great Platonic writers had this sense of plurality within the ultimate principle. And I think we see that in Christianity through the Trinity. And we also I believe, have to take that into consideration, that the divine might not be limited to number, and we might have to let go of the idea of number as a category to define the divine, and it might be a polycentric divine rather than a individual divine, in the sense that we can interact with it and participate in it. But I'm very pro Christianity. The kind of Christianity that Matt and Jacob are talking about here is extremely refreshing, to be honest. And I think that Christianity has a bright future ahead as long as people like Matt Segal are in the front lines bearing the weight of this conversation that needs to be had as we fight against like materialism and a secular capitalism that has created a husk of a world and emptied the life out of our lives, our existence as humans, and kind of cut us out from a participatory worldview. As we fight against that, I think people from all kinds of theologies, be it monotheistic, Islamic, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, I think we all need to find the common ground in the emancipatory and theurgical frameworks that we were talking about here in this conversation, Matt Segal and Jacob. If you are for deliberation of the world, if you are for the fair treatment of others, if you are for this, cosmic Christ being instantiated through love of each other and through, brotherhood and sisterhood and through this open acceptance of everybody as they are, I think we have to see each other as allies. I don't think Christ died to erase paganism. I think a lot of people have this idea that the people crucified Christ because they were pagan, and pagan is bad. But I don't think Christ died to erase paganism, but rather to end empire. I think any theology that stands against empire will have room for Christ in its plurality, at least in its periphery. It would be interesting to see a discourse between modern pagans and this meta Christianity that's coming up. It will be at some point necessary. I think paganism definitely has a growth ceiling. I don't think it's going to grow past a certain point. There's been too many centuries of Christianity in Europe and the United States for paganism to come back full force, but I think it's going to be a minority that we're going to have to, at some point, interact with. A lot of modern pagans tend to be very anti-Christian, and I think that's because a lot of modern pagans come from histories of abuse in the church or histories of, ugly stuff that happens in the institution of the church and the community around the church. And we might have to talk through that, It's going to be an interesting conversation, and I'd be more than happy to be part of that. I think on secularism, I think this is the conversation where I've seen Matt Segal be like the most hard line against secularism in his talk, and I was even taken aback, a little bit. I've been listening to Matt Segal for like 5-6 years, and it's still kind of this talk really was like, oh wow, okay, this is getting serious, I want to be fair to secularism. I don't want to strawman it. We do have to thank secularism for its contribution to human rights, to the rights for women, and generally a lot of things in Europe and the United States and Canada that we take for granted and would be really fucking pissed if we had it taken away. The history of secularism from its early days in the Protestant Revolution to today is, and I believe this came up in the conversation, is we can't ignore it. It's obvious that it's left its footprint and made positive impacts on us. I do think, and I do agree with Matt, though, that secularism is going to happen in a sort of whiplash. And it's gone way too quickly, and I think overextended itself. And here's what and this is where, like, in my previous recording, I was listening to it and I was like, no, I can say it much better. We have to observe that secularism has not been the liberatory movement that the new atheists in the late 2000s, early, in 2010s. I don't think it's the liberatory movement that the new atheists believed that it was, or believe that it is. We have an extremely secular Europe and the United States. And in Europe and the United States, we still live by this different God called the market. And the market rules everything. The market is our new overlord. We still have extractive policies that harm the global south, that are creating environmental, ecological crises all around the planet. Secularism hasn't stopped this. It's not that religion was evil and we had to get rid of it. It's something else. And I think secularism was a false savior. Secularism still benefits colonial white European hegemony. Secularism still promotes oppressive structures that everybody suffers from. And here is what Matt said that, first took me by surprise because it was the hardest statement that I've heard Matt say on this particular topic. And I believe he said that the idea that when you die, it all just goes black, that is, I forget the exact words. I listened to this like yesterday. It was that this is a dangerous, not dangerous, but this is a very harmful set of worldviews to our meaning making and our, survival here on Earth. And I was thinking about that today as I was doing my errands and driving in a car. And I think I kind of cracked it as to like what it meant. Because whatever we say or whatever statement we make about what happens when we die is also at the same time a statement about what we are right now. Because when I die, everything just goes black for me and my brain shuts down and then I am no more. That means that I am a brain connected to a nervous system and a set of muscles and a skeleton. And that is an important context, or that's an important thing to note. That what we believe happens when we die shapes how we see ourselves now. And when we see ourselves as brains connected to nervous systems and bodies and all that, some even actually have like an even more extreme view that, that our sense of identity is actually just a epiphenomenal byproduct. When we talk to like the likes of like Daniel Dennett and people that follow Daniel Dennett, this epiphenomenalism that consciousness is just a byproduct, right? Both of those views, I know, don't allow for a deep participation in the world. The view that when we die our meat just rots, that view limits the gamut of participation we can have in the world right now. We can't participate in anything sacred anymore, because anything sacred will only be, at the very end, something going on in our brain. Nothing more, nothing less. I think it was a Michael Levin that said that you can always look at it as just physics when you're looking at it in the past, but when you're looking at it in the future, like when you're trying to extrapolate into the future, you can't just rely on physics. Something else has to come in. And I think that when it comes to this thing about our participation in the sacred, I believe it is important to call the bluff of secularism and say, no, I believe there's something else. I believe there's something more to the world than what is observable and measurable. And I can participate in it. I think that's something we have to, that's a claim we have to make, and we have to make it strongly. Because I think it's going to require that to bring the conversation to the side of participation in something that will unify us and bring us together. Going back to the thing about Islam, I don't think Islam is the enemy. I don't think feminism is the enemy. I don't think queer people or trans people are the enemy. In fact, all of this stuff that we see people say is the antithesis of the West. I think these are challenges for us when we see queer people and trans people redefine what gender is and go against centuries of, European doctrine. when we see women taking up more space as they want more rights that have been denied to them, rights that have been wrongfully denied to them throughout history. We are being challenged, here as men, as Western men, we're being challenged to analyze and let go of the parts of our institutions that are not conducive to liberation and well-being for everybody. And if Christianity is meant to have any sort of relevance in the future, any sort of relevance at all, I think it's going to need a radical acceptance of queerness, of women, of people from different races. And this was talked about in the conversation. I'm really glad that we're having that kind of conversation in this corner of the internet. Like I said, Islam, feminism, queer people are not the enemy. I think the enemy is a dark, transhumanist cult of wealth. Let me put my tinfoil hat on, And this cult is seeking to instantiate capitalism more and more into the fabric of our life world. They're trying to financialize everything. They're trying to reduce everything to transactions. They're trying to create a seat of power in a throne of money. And that's our enemy. It's a strong enemy. It's a very dangerous enemy. And these conversations that we have, I think, need to talk about that more. We don't have the time or energy to point fingers at each other or create some kind of culture war between ourselves when there is a cabal of billionaires that are actively looking to drain our life world of its vitality and its sacredness. And I'll leave it at that. It's been 47 minutes and 15 seconds, and I think I've talked a lot. And I love talking. I love hearing my own voice. But this is it. I wanted to add this. I think this second take is kind of better, noticeably better than the last one. And Matt, always love your stuff. And Jacob, I'm going to check out your stuff more. This is my first video of you, of seeing your stuff. So I really hope to see more of your stuff and then kind of go through your videos. Really interesting conversation. And I'm really excited about the conversations that are taking place. So let's hope for more of these. And let's see what the future brings. So for now, good night.